Okay. So hi, nice to see
Hi,
you.
good to see you.
To start off with, would you like to say your name and where you are?
Yes, my name is Chris Hakyung Kim,
Mhm.
and I'm in New York City at my home.
Okay. Um, and the first real question for you is, who are you as a human being? And that
Ah,
can be passions or values or qualities or whatever you'd like.
yeah, uh, so many things come to mind. I thought about this recently because I had to update my website bio. And the first thing I wrote was about how I see myself as a student of theater and a student of philosophy. And lastly, but not, less importantly, a student of Gestalt therapy. And I say Gestalt therapy because it's very important to me to say that instead of saying I'm a student of psychology, because I don't think that carries that meaning for me at all, actually. I don't see myself as a psychologist. I see me more as a Gestalt therapist, as a person who deeply identifies with the teachings and the people in it. Part of the reason I'm doing this. And I would say I'm very fun loving, a big fan of comedy, uh, in theater, movies, shows, sketch comedy. Humor is very important to me, I realize, and being playful in that sense with other people, passionate. So that's a part of me. There's another part of me that's more like likes to sit down quietly and read, and think, which is also very important to spend time away from others. So those two parts are both, I think, very important, to define me. And I'm also a son of my mom and dad, and then a brother, and a husband, and a friend. I hope a good one. And I also think of myself not just a student, but also as a teacher, which recently, in the recent years, became more important to me because I worked as a supervisor for years in a hospital where I had the privilege of teaching so many bright minds, and the psychology interns and residents, the psychiatry residents, and teaching classes, lots of supervision, individual and group. And I've learned so much by preparing and then having heartfelt conversations with them. A lot of them come to my mind. I recently left the hospital, so it's more sort of prominent in my mind how much I've enjoyed that since I don't have that anymore. But yeah, being a teacher, as sort of awkward as it sounds, because I see myself more as a student, but it's also very much fulfilling for me to be in that role. So I hope to do that more in the future. Yeah.
Okay. And would you say that there are certain sort of central values that you carry in the different roles that you play
Oof.
or live? I guess it's not really playing, but maybe it's playful.
Right, right. Value is, I understand it as sort of a driving force or motivation, of as to what guides me. And I think one important part is to to be seen and heard as a person myself, and which I think was one of the reasons I started off as a student of philosophy, but then gradually evolved out of it, and became more interested in theater and also more interested in psychology and therapy because it involves the other, in a more direct way. Philosophy also involves the other, but in such a indirect way because they give their theories to me and then they lay it out in such a way it's kind of an enigma, and then it takes a while to digest it, probably decades, and that didn't feel as fulfilling for me. So a lot of my interests are driven by other humans. So I'm in a way curious about others and wish they were curious about me. And I think this is also part of it, where it's very weird to talk about myself, um, and being recorded, but also there's such a in touch with the desire of wanting to do that and wanting to be understood as a human, but also probably as a therapist, as a student of the disciplines that I'm such a fan of. So I think those are the things that drives me. I was always passionate about those things since I was little, learning about the world and wishing that others would talk to me about that, what I have learned, and listen to what they have learned. I'm not sure if that answers it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it does make me wonder, who have you met in your life who's been significant? Who comes to mind as another human being who's influenced or really impacted you from any part of your life?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, thinking about this interview, I realized how much I thought about my father because he's a Gestalt therapist, and a brilliant one. And he is someone, he's also Dr. Kim, and then he's also someone who introduced me to the world of Gestalt therapy since a very young age, since college, and also had taught me so much because I was initially trained in the Korean Gestalt Therapy Association, which is a huge movement, as big or even bigger, I think, as CBT in Korea. And it's an amazing community, and I felt very connected from working with them, translating in a lot of their international conferences with. We had to honor and privilege to invite people like Irving Polster, Gary Onteff twice, Philip Brownell, Michael Vincent Miller, and Jeffrey Teich. So many people came to Korea and taught about Gestalt therapy and showed and played with us, and that was all part of his legacy. So I felt as a Gestalt therapist, I've learned so much from him, and owe a lot of my sort of knowledge or wisdom that was kind of passed down. So it's kind of a family business in that way, I would say. And this lineage means a lot to me. Although on a personal level, the separation, individuation is another issue that I grapple with a lot, still in the process of which I also have learned so much about myself, about him. And in that process, I would say there are so many other teachers who taught me through it. Irving Polster, I've translated for him. Didn't quite know what to make of it at the time. It was 2006 when I was still in college, senior year, and I didn't really, know what to make of it. There was something magical, wonderful about him. So and his mostly from watching his other work, DVDs and stuff, and learning from his books. Owe so much to him, and I know one of the interviews on the Humans of Gestalt was with him, and I love him so much, admire him so much as a teacher and a person, and I think I would like to name a few of Gestalt mentors that it comes to my mind. Well, Michael Vincent Miller, no doubt, one of the biggest influences, his writings, his teachings. I had to, translate it. It was the last time I translated an international conference in Korea in Seoul. He came in 2015, I think, and it was a wonderful opportunity because at that time I was already, licensed and practicing. So I was, I think, much more in touch with what he was talking about, what he was teaching, and of course Ruela Frank, who I owe so much to. I'm still in training with her, and I love and admire her so much that she feels very close to me in my learning and in my growth in overall. So those are, and I've never really worked or learned from her, but Lynn Jacobs, who's a teacher of my father, is someone I, learned more from her writings and, articles, the enduring relational theme. Those, notions are very central to my understanding of Gestalt therapy. So yeah, I mean, and I also, want to mention Nancy McWilliams, who is someone made me decide wanting to come to America, to the US to study here. She is a part of the graduate school I studied in at Rutgers, and in my doctorate program. And I just knew her from readings because I helped translate her book to Korean in Korea. And it felt very warm, which is different from what you would imagine from a psychoanalytic writing or case conceptualization and therapy, right? And then that was one of the biggest reasons. Also, despite my love and connection to Gestalt therapy, made me hungry for other disciplines, such as relationally informed psychoanalysis. And I came to the US, and then I was afraid that she may be different from how I imagined her from my readings and how she came across from the books. And I would say she was even better, more wonderful, not better, even more human. And I still remember the first class, my first graduate school day, 2009, was one of her introduction to psychoanalytic theory classes, and she talked about how dreams, the dreams we have, and a lot of times painful things that come up when you're sort of displaced, dislocated, because a lot of people come from overseas or from other cities, other places of the country to study, to pursue something noble, but also feel so lost, and sacrifice something to be there. And the way she sort of talked about it really touched me. And throughout the years of learning from her and being in her class or supervision groups, really helped me grow as a clinician. So yeah, I owe so much to all these teachers. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I've learned and felt so much from the people I've been an interpreter for as well. It's really a very unique perspective and experience.
Yes.
So I understand what you're saying. And what about part of your own story? What would you say is an event or a set of circumstances that you've experienced that has somehow defined you or shaped you?
Immediately, what comes to my mind is how much of what I perceived as failures or setbacks at the time really informed how to digest things and how to make sense of the world in relation to me. What I was just thinking about was when I was in middle school, in Korea, the last year of middle school, you apply to some of the prestigious high schools, and they have these entrance exams. And I thought I would, no doubt be able to go to one of these foreign language speaking and teaching high schools that actually my brother was already a part of. So I was like, oh, no doubt I'm a, shoo-in. And then what happened was I made some mistakes in the entrance exam and miserably failed. So I ended up, not getting in. And that really shook me, where like how Ruella would explain, like the ground is the basic trust, and it just kind of disappears one day. Is how it felt, and it was a very difficult time. I remember it very clearly, and although my parents, my brother, my friends said it was okay, my teachers, they're like, it's fine, you'll do fine. But I felt as though it's the end of me, end of the world for me as I knew it, because I had a certain idea of how my life would be, and that just shook everything and took it away. And then I remember the next 3 years sort of sitting with that bitterness, this anger, the frustration, and the loss of what I could have gotten out of it. And that really, I think, informed me. In a way, it's like in a way, like Alfred Adler would say, your sense of inferiority or insecurity drives you in certain directions. In addition to your birth order, which is also, I have a bigger brother who's smart and handsome and popular, so that also creates that hierarchy in my mind. But I think that really helped me actually to be in touch with what's not so nice in life and what's painful, and actually drew me closer to reading philosophy, a little bit depressing, but existential philosophy and Nietzsche and whatnot. And then also,
yeah, it helps with the angst when you're in your teen years and suffering.
oh yeah, absolutely. And very angry music. Nirvana comes to mind.
Oh, awesome.
Kurt Cobain, always, yeah, my icon. And you know, at the time, Rage Against the Machine was big, so that was also part
It's
of,
the soundtrack for Suffering. That's
yes,
great.
yes, and
Mhm.
it's I think something you cannot learn from school or learn from just hearing about it, and it's
Mhm.
similar throughout my life. Those moments when I have, this existential crisis. I think, and my dad would interestingly say sometimes when I share some of those things in the moment, he would say, "Congratulations." What? And then he would say, "Now you don't have to learn about it. You know what it feels like, um, to be sad, to be anxious, to be, frightened." And it actually, really helped me, like consoled me even in that moment, to think of it that way, that now I'm in touch with something that I could maybe understand intellectually, but it's very hard to connect with on a certain level. And I still feel that way when I speak with my clients, and when they bring something that's so painful. I don't say I'm sorry because I think that, well, sorry, it happened. It makes it much easier for me to access their experience, which interestingly goes back to my love of acting and theater, because that's such a close. Well, Fritz Perls was, a director of theater, and it's such a interesting meeting point, contacting of theater art and philosophy and psychology, where you're sort of deeply in touch with suffering, human suffering, in a way that's not just understood, that's felt. And I think that's so central in good acting, that you just kind of, the pain is palpable, or the joy. And also in therapy, it's not something you can just come up with. Um, yeah.
It's authentic. And as you're speaking, I'm thinking sort of the difference between idealized potential
Mm,
and just the judgment free experience of what is. It's like an improv. You don't know, and
mm.
oh, I have this now, and the expectations just go out the window.
Yeah, it's so freeing. It's so freeing. Um, like the improv piece of it, because being silly or sometimes making a fool out of yourself is part of the process. And there is no clear cut, like, binary success or failure. And I think, I get caught up in that so quickly, and Rilla once said, being the best at something, being the worst is implied. And I think that way all the time. I feel that way all the time. When I think, am I the best therapist, or am I the best interviewee, or am I the best, whatever. And that, I think, puts you in that bind so quickly, and you tense up. Whereas in, theater, it was just so freeing, so liberating, which I never felt before, I think,
Hmm.
in college. Yeah.
Okay. So, on another aspect of yourself, I'm curious how you experience and understand yourself within your gender or masculinity or as a
Mm.
man.
Oh, I was, I'm actually meeting one of my friends, two of my friends today after this, from the military, who are both very dear friends of mine, and I very feel close to on an emotional level. But I also remember this, like the mandatory military service I had to be part of in Korea for 2 years, in my early 20s. And that also really shaped me, because I got in touch with, I think, what they call the toxic masculinity, and a very oppressive, violent culture that's inherent in Korean culture, that I knew about, but I wasn't too sure what it was until I served in the army, because there it was crystal clear, the way they talk, the way they, expect you to be, completely submissive, and also very aggressive to one another in a way that it felt very, scarring, especially with the first, few months, because I was a student of philosophy and theater at the time, and expected it, but once you're part of it, there's no choice. You don't have a choice, and I see that everywhere in the Korean society, in grad schools, in companies, and even in families, and where hierarchy is very much felt, and then you're expected to act in a certain way, speak in a certain way, and not do certain things. And that really affected me in a way, that I think made me a more aggressive and a mean person in so many ways. And I think it took a long time to undo a lot of that effect. And part of the reason I came to America and staying here is, as problematic as this society is, at least there's something very freeing, because it's like the default culture of, I guess, that can be felt oppressive to women, to younger people, to people who are not, heterosexual, or binary. It's just something that's so built into the culture, because of the very troublesome, painful history that Korea went through with the Korean War and the Japanese occupation of 36 years, and this built-in insecurity that comes from it, and this humiliation. And the rise of the elite after the war, and the Americans came in, and I served as part of the American interpreter at their army base, which was a privilege, but also speaks to my privilege and the long history of oppression that comes from. They literally occupied us right in the middle, the ground, the land of Seoul. They occupied this huge military base that was actually never belonged to Koreans, for centuries, because before it was the Chinese army, before it was the Japanese army. So that land never belonged to us. They're slowly in the process of reclaiming it. But yeah, so it's just such a long-winded answer, I know, but it's such a good part of, I think, how I saw myself, and was invisible to it, that I'm a man, heterosexual, college educated, and come from middle to upper middle, high, like social status, and the cultural sort of capital that I get from my dad and my mom. And it just didn't even occur to me until I'm thinking more and more about those things. And once I'm stripped from it, largely once I'm here, and I'm certainly suddenly the minority and the Asian, I'm the one who's invisible, and that, I think, created the awareness, that I very very much appreciate, but also makes it easier for me to identify with people who don't have that. And I think that's something I try to remind myself a lot, and sort of distance myself from, but not also demonize. I don't think all Korean men are like that, or like misogynistic, or oppressive. But I get this allergic reaction pretty quickly, which I'm very much aware of, when I'm spoken to in a certain way or referred to in a certain way. So I try not to be triggered so quickly by it, but also be mindful that I don't treat other people that way.
It's not long-winded. It's a complex answer, and it's a
Yeah.
complex question. I mean, how and where and when we learn to be ourselves in any aspect.
Yeah.
Of course it's complex. Of course it's complicated.
Yeah.
And I do really appreciate a lot of what you're saying in your answer. And I think it sort of does go into another question, which I have, which is how you experience power and privilege in your life.
Oh, big time. I was born in Germany, West Germany at the time, because my father was studying in the University of Bonn. And in overall, it was, I think, a wonderful experience growing up in Germany until age of 8, before I moved back to South Korea. But also, it made me very much aware of me being the other, because it was a very small town, just the outskirts of Bonn, which is was the capital of West Germany, but a very small city. And in that sort of kindergarten or grade school that I went to, I was the only one who didn't look the same. And that experience, I think, made me keenly aware of what I have and don't have in terms of power, in terms of maybe charm, that comes natural to some, and also, the language. That was, for me, German came very easily, but then I was sort of instructed to talk in Korean at home, and which I think is very common in families or immigrants, and then they didn't want me to lose my cultural roots, so they made me my parents made me read in Korean and speak only in Korean at home, and it was painful because I couldn't use it anywhere else. I wasn't very good at it. And then once I moved back, it was shocking because first I thought I belonged better because everyone looked like me, but I was quickly made aware I'm not because I didn't speak Korean very well. I somehow acted very differently. I couldn't eat anything spicy. Still can't. And also, there was a lot I didn't know, and I remember, back to sort of the oppressive culture. The Korean teachers didn't have that much patience for me, so they would teach me by humiliating me in front of class, and so I have those kind of vivid memories. So that's when I didn't have power, I guess. And then, once I sort of discovered being good at something, which was studying, reading, and remembering, and being good at standardized tests and whatnot, I think that's when I found, oh, this is the way I can belong. Or maybe this is the only way I can belong. And this is where I'm going to draw that from. And looking back, I also sort of become keenly aware of the power of privilege I was afforded, because my house was filled with books that were interesting, that were philosophy, that were not literature, and that was very stimulating. And I sought out and really was hungry for more. And my dad really taught me a lot, especially in high school, how to think logically and in a way that would do well in a philosophy department, for example, and help me to read towards the right direction. And that's not something that people have, right? That it's something you can pay for. But I think I owe a lot in terms of how I got into like a prestigious college and also did well there, to my father, and how much sort of his, like the fertile ground that he created for me in terms of his friends, the conversation he would have at home at or dinner, and how he would push me towards to think in a certain way. And I think that really like blossomed in college because as I said, I'm a man, heterosexual, able-bodied, and there's something very easy with that because I'm right at the majority, and I didn't have to work for money. My parents were happy to pay for my tuition, and that really afforded me to blossom in a way that I didn't have to spend 30, like working 2 part-time jobs and to support myself. So I could do theater, for example, or I could just read, or I could just drink, I could do whatever. And that, I think, is my power and privilege. And even in America, I came here and I knew, well, I was lucky to have, good financial package and support from the graduate program. But, I knew in the back of my head, if I really needed to, I could fall back on my parents. And that, I think, afforded me the freedom to be brave, to take risks, and try things that I maybe normally can't or wouldn't try. And I think that really became my ground, right, in so many ways, emotionally, financially, politically. And I think, I try not to forget that. And I'm glad you asked that, actually, because it makes me keenly aware how much I do have, even when it doesn't feel that way. So.
Mhm. Yeah, I think it's also fascinating, maybe they're adverse childhood experiences, but the post-traumatic growth that comes
Right.
from all of that culture shifting
Yeah.
as children. I mean, it's incredible. I mean, kids who are interpreting, moving between worlds in languages, in concepts, in ways of thinking, just the levels of understanding that are just so deep. It's beyond consciousness. It is embodied. Just figuring out how to be in this world and that world. It's really incredible. It really is.
I agree.
And it's difficult and painful and traumatic.
Oh yeah.
And it makes you weird, but then you can, appreciate it later.
I know, and looking back, it kind of makes sense and adds up, and makes you appreciate it. But in the moment, it's just chaos. And there is a lot of creative adjusting happening, and making something out of that pain and grow. I think it took me a long time to see it that way. Yeah.
And I'm sure there's ways that it's going to play out that haven't even come up yet, right?
Right.
So that is actually another question, which is how you're experiencing yourself at your current age and the aging process in general. What is that for you?
Such a good question. I'm keenly aware because it's been only 2 weeks from my 40th birthday, and which I think in part supported me to do this, because I thought it would be a very good point in my life to check in about that kind of a question, right? Where am I? And then where do I find myself now in relation to my trajectory up to this point and where I wish to be in the future? And I feel like I'm in a very good place in so many ways, because I owe this to a lot of my own therapy and own learnings, such as Rilla, where I found what drives me that's becoming more and more clear. And there's so much excitement in me because I am doing private practice full time, and I'm talking to my friends, colleagues who are also in the field of potentially collaborating, which is something I dream for, having a space where we can talk about and, create something that feels like ours, which is very rare. And that's something that I feel very hungry for. And in that sense, a lot of the trajectory I took to get to this point supports that. And I feel like, working at jobs that were challenging and having seen the part of the world, even in New York City, that I probably would have not been a part of if I, let's say, started a private practice right out of graduate school. And having seen, because I worked in my first job out of grad school was working in nursing homes. And then it was working in an inpatient psychiatric unit for 3 years, dual diagnosis unit, which I very much enjoyed, and then outpatient hospital clinic. And those experiences are just, something I really value, which goes back to my earlier sort of thought about what was challenging for me is essentially what defines me. And those are the things that makes this feel so much richer in a way. And it just opens up all parts of me as a human, where I feel this creative force is sort of kicking in and wanting to play and wanting to just, expand. And I feel like this is the starting point. This is like the starting situation for the next chapter until I'm 80 or whatever. So it's just going to be this. At least that's my hope.
Interesting. I just turned 40 this summer as well. I actually feel very similarly. It's an interesting time. It really is.
Yes.
Huh. So you talked a little bit about sort of the intergenerational family business of Gestalt. I kind of want to ask two things about that. And, one is, when did you choose to come into Gestalt? But also, I wonder when or how it became part of your awareness. I mean, people can have, parents who have a job, but how did it sort of filter into your life?
See, that's the question I grapple with until a few years ago when I sort of asked my question, did I become a psychologist and a Gestalt therapist for my dad? And that's such an essential question. And if I did I waste my whole life trying to get approval from him in a way, wanting to be acknowledged in a very specific way? And the question,
That sounds like a lot of psychoanalysis to figure that out.
for sure, and the question kind of begs a binary answer there, right? It's like the
Yeah.
dichotomy of yes or no. But I realized that how much I liked philosophy independent from him, and also therapy independent from him, and it was supported by him, and I feel very much appreciative of it. And that's the whole process of separation, individuation of what's mine and what's yours, and is it something that we can just cut like butter in half. And the point I've arrived to now is I get why my dad was drawn to Gestalt therapy, because my master's program in Seoul was a heavily CBT, slightly psychedelic informed, a lot of CBT stuff going on, which is, mainstream everywhere you go, right, in the US and in Korea. And how it didn't sit well with for me, I really appreciate their insight, and I still use, for example, DBT workbooks or the CBT like automatic thought table or some of their exercises. It's brilliant, and I think they tap into something that's very tangible and practical that I very much appreciate, like such as in like general anxiety disorder, they make them set certain period of worrying time of a day and then make them just sit down and worry as much and intensely as they can, which is kind of an experiment. And I really like those types of suggestions. But the overall premise of it is based on, I think, I'm being very crude here, but a scientific positivism where you see there's a deep-rooted belief that you know something that the patient doesn't, and that you have better ideas than them, and they have something that's going on that they name maladaptive or rational, that you can help them correct. And they actually use that word. And then there's something that doesn't sit well with me because I come from studying Husserl or Nietzsche, or this existential philosophy, where very much the focus on in the person and the inner subjectivity of it. And in that sense, my love is a very specific type of philosophy, not like Socrates, but something that's much more specific, and that's heavily informed, the phenomenology heavily informed Gestalt therapies, it is where my interest and love comes in. And I came in touch with that, I think, much later, because first it was kind of spoon-fed to me when I was, appointed as a translator, interpreter for a Gestalt therapy conference, which I liked. But I was like, what is this? I like theater, but I don't know what this. And
Yeah,
then
it's like, I'll
later
say
on,
these words, sure,
yeah. Like, what is this word? What's retrospection? It didn't add up at all at the time. But then I liked a part of it where, for example, Irving Poster would get up out of the chair and dance with the client, out of like thousands of people, and having this moment of connection that transcends language or culture. And that deep sense of connection, there's nothing fake about it. There's nothing superior about it. There's nothing that says, I know something that I need to interpret for you. And the sense of psychoanalysis is that although it is moving much closer to that direction, especially in the much more contemporary modern psychoanalysis in the relational realm, I still think there's a certain type of being reserved and having to be smart. And that Gestalt therapists, I think Dr. Poster calls as psychoanalytic marksmanship, that you have to somehow thread the needles and hit the mark by making an interpretation that sounds brilliant, or the patient goes, wow, I never thought about that. And I think that's something that I felt very much pressure to do. Maybe I took it the wrong way, but I think in my psychoanalytic training, I always felt this pressure of having to think something on the fly and having to remember my formulation and having to provide something, having to do something. And when Willa started teaching about if you don't know what to do, don't do anything, it also liberated me in a sense where I could be me and be curious and wonder and have a moment of connection where it feels real. And that also partly, well, actually, a lot of what I'm doing right now with you, putting myself out there and not worrying so much about what happens when the veil is sort of removed and there is no space for transference and for transference analysis, is the belief that me being human is not detrimental or does not prevent someone from having an experience with me. And that part of Gestalt therapy is something that feels so real, not on an intellectual level, because I felt that way every time I went to the training programs in Korea and saw these, wonderful teachers of Gestalt therapy come and do their thing. And after I came here and became part of the experience here in New York, that was always my experience. That there is nothing that happens that's filtered here. That they're right here with me, and that's where I think my love of what I do is something that's mine. That's different from my dad's, and I think there's so much commonality because I'm similar to him. I look very similar, and my disposition, the way I am, is very similar. Part because of my upbringing, but also part because of the genes, I believe, and then which is okay. And I'm very much at peace with it right now, where I feel very much connected with my desire and my interest and my joy of being a Gestalt therapist. And that does not have to be contingent upon what my dad wants or doesn't want.
Yeah. When it's coming down to sort of that full presence and using yourself,
yeah.
I mean, we can't do that
if
it's in service of someone else, right?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
So how would you say that Gestalt therapy and any levels of that process or that community or that context has affected you as a person?
Oh, I owe everything. I think I don't think it's an exaggeration to say I owe so much of my personal growth from my readings, where it actually feels like they're talking to me a lot of times. And also part of the group experiences and the visual experiences of being in Gestalt therapy myself and being part of a Gestalt group that either I run or I'm a part of, a member of, where I become so much more aware of what I do and what I feel without shame and without having to make a meaning out of it. And that's where I am, is, and I say Rilla a lot today. Rilla would say, where else would you be? And that really touched me because, yeah, where else would I be? This is where I am. And that type of full acceptance of what is the actuality of my presence and my existence is something that just deeply, deeply supported not only the part of me that feels good, but also that part of me that feels angry or anxious or, bitter or sad, all of it. And I think the least I try to do for everyone I meet, including my clients, is to be that person for them. That I feel like I have such a long way to go, but I try to be that person because I owe so much for the Gestalt therapists I've met along the way, even if it was just like a 10, 15-minute exercise that we did, how it just touched me in a way and held me in a way, still holds me in a way that I cannot compare to anything else. And I think you get a glimpse of it while living, maybe being an actor in a theater. That type of connection is rare. And I feel like it's such a privilege to have that, because when I speak to my trainees or, teach classes about addiction, which is part of my interest, some people would say, that feels very human. And I say, exactly. It's the only way to be. and I think that's, I think my such affection, admiration of Gestalt therapy comes from that experience, and not just, because the theory is superior.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think your answer is probably already woven through what you've said, but I often ask, do you feel like you're part of a Gestalt community, and what
Oh, I
does that
see.
mean to you?
That's something I'm actually working on, because it's hard. I think everyone's so busy, and especially in New York City, everyone's doing their own thing, and especially COVID and survival. You have to make a living, and it may not involve something that's so gestalty for you. And I feel like first my passion was wanting to do theater and drama therapy in the community, but now my wish is to be part of a network of Gestalt therapists that I feel connected with, and create something that feels exciting, like a project. It could be time limited, it could be something long term. But as of now, I feel like my connection is mostly through supervision groups. I have two right now that I'm a part of, and that's mostly very rich experience, and very intellectually stimulating. But it's different from meeting them outside of the supervision and actually doing something together. And it's always tricky, I think, and we're much more used to doing our own practice, and that can be a bit more isolating. And the way we work together is maybe writing something together, or maybe doing something like this, or maybe being part of a training program, right? But my wish is to learn more and teach more in person, in a place. And well, it could be online, of course. I know a lot of most of your work takes place online, and I think there's something so wonderful about that, being connected there. And I was just reading about your article with David, that you talk about the online space, and I think of that as a very new and exciting possibility. But also being part of a city that's so exciting and full of life, I have this kind of budding need of wanting to do that more also in a room.
Hmm,
Yeah,
makes sense.
yeah.
So, what would you say is actually the essence of what you do? I
Uh,
mean, are there particular things that you're very focused on, or communities or elements of your work that you highlight?
hmm. I think the scope of work that I do, or did a lot in the past few years, and am still doing, is actually a very specific population that I work with. I worked with a lot of people who are suffering from and recovering from substance use disorders, addiction, and overall. It doesn't have to be alcohol or drug use just specifically, but a lot of behavior addiction. People come with video game, internet, maybe shopping, gambling, porn, so many things that they feel like this very strong attachment to. It's very hard to break free from, and also cuts the oxygen that you get from other people, from interpersonal relationships. And I was introduced to it during my graduate school training, because I was part of a grant at Rutgers, where I did research studies on that. And I got interested more in the meditation aspect of it, because it was a very fancy way of doing meditation. Essentially, it was called heart rate variability biofeedback, and it's like watching your own signal and breathing in a certain way that calms you down immediately, and really helps you with craving and whatnot. And that really informed my understanding the physiological part of addiction. And then my interest grew more and more into the attachment piece of it, and then the developmental trauma of it. And I've been reading more and more about it, and then teaching really helps to sort of consolidate my thoughts and feelings. And then also being part of an inpatient community where they do dual diagnosis treatment was a big part of my growth. So that's still very much my interest and the scope of my specialty, if you will. And that's something that people come to see me for. And I think that's where I feel very effective, very sort of empowered and comfortable, but also very much privileged, because it's not easy to come to someone and talk about addiction. And it's also, you know, hard to believe that talk therapy can be useful in that. And usually it's a combination of things, of course. You know, you need medication assisted treatment. Sometimes you need to go to the rehab and family work. But a lot of times this sort of individual working, and when it happens in a powerful way, which usually does with Gestalt, I feel so effective and useful that really informs and enriches my experience as a therapist. Yeah.
Okay. And what would you say some of the challenges that you run into are?
Oof. I think it's, you know, isolation, I would say, because being individual provider, I share an office with my wonderful colleague, but I don't see her as much because we use it different days. So, you know, being in individual practice and sort of creating your own style and creating your own rhythm is very much where I'm in right now. And it kind of keeps me from wanting to be ambitious or expanding yet. And that can be isolating. And a lot of my colleagues and friends who are in private practice and just do that, talk about it, right? Because that's why they want to do more supervision or teaching or being involved in volunteer work, or wanting to do group supervision, I think. So that's something probably that I will look into. But also the other challenge is, I guess, being accustomed to freedom, because I'm not used to it. If I think about being in school, grad school, jobs, right? The perimeters are very clear, and the expectations are, you know, to a T. It's very regimented in a way, and you don't have much wiggle room, and you resent it. But then when you're given, hey, you have so many choices now, you know, how about a million choices? Then it paralyzes you a lot of ways, right? And that's why they talk about, you know, this sort of dystopian future where you're given a number and your preferred professions kind of decided for you. And there's something comforting about that, right? As dystopian as it sounds. Or Steve Jobs would say, you know, people don't know what they want. I'll give you what you want, right? Here's your next iPhone. But in a way, for me, sort of being in front of so many choices and being presented with such open field of possibilities, I try to make myself more excited than paralyzed, or, you know, guilt-ridden about not doing enough projects, for example. So I'm fine with that, actually. It's a challenge, but also it's an opportunity. Yeah.
It's interesting, the challenge of managing freedom. That's
Yes, very
that's an
much so.
interesting one.
Yeah.
And also, sort of as a storytelling note, I wonder what comes up as you're sort of stirring through all of this Gestalty history and your own. What comes up as sort of a highlight or as a moment that has stayed with you in a special way?
In Gestalt therapy or in my life?
Either way.
Oh, wow. Oof. Oh, I'll give you one. This is a very personal story, but I think it would be useful in a way to convey my relationship with my father, actually. So this was a few years ago. I think 7 or 8 years ago, when I was struggling with dissertation, which is a very common struggle in the doctoral program. And I was faced with, you know, a lot of revisions and struggling. And then one morning I had something very unusual sensation, a feeling in my whole body that I didn't know what to make of. And I ended up going to the emergency room. And then the very nice young doctor was like, you're familiar, you're a psychologist, you're familiar with panic attacks, right? And then I was like, what? And then it just immediately went away. But
those are things that other people have, right?
Right, like, what, you have? And then she was like, yeah, my dad's, you know, a psychologist, you know, so I know some of it. And then, you know, is something stressful happening in your life? I was like, yeah, and so I went home, and then later at night, I had a conversation with my dad, and then, well, he said, "Congratulations, great. Now you know what it's like." But also, we did a very interesting experiment. We first did like lying on the leaves of the forest, sort of, ground, and our body becoming very heavy limb by limb. That was very, very helpful to sort of like ground, like you're gonna sink into the core of the earth kind of experiment. And then he asked me about what it was like when I was sort of feeling, very panicky. And then I said, I remember being very dizzy. And I didn't know what it was, because I've had a lot of, clients talking about panicky feelings, but being dizzy is kind of peculiar to me. And then it's mostly about like kind of breathing, or a lot of like, oh, I'm gonna die. And I thought about that, was interesting. And then my dad was like, wow, that kind of image of a fly comes to my mind, that like a fly in a jar, like that's trying to escape, right? It's like, "Wah," right? And then he was like, let's be a fly together. And I was like, what? So we did this thing where we both sort of uh, be, became a fly, and we started kind of like flying around in the room. We were on a phone, me in my room and him in his room, and then we're just kind of flying. And then he suggested, why don't we try landing? So we landed as flies. And then he was like, look around and see if there's anywhere you can escape. And then I found this little crack underneath the door of my room, and I was like, I found it. There's a crack. And he was like, let's try it. Let's try if you can squeeze through it. And I somehow managed to. And then it was a whole different experience. Because now I was outside in the world, just flying as a fly. Um, and that was the experience. And I later talked about it to my wife, now at the time my girlfriend, and then she actually drew me. She's an artist, she's an illustrator, and she drew me a landing strip and a fly uh, doing this with a signal. And it was very cute. And so,
That's awesome.
that's, I think, such a moment of connection. It was very touching, and very helpful. So between my relationship with my dad, and with my wife, that really supported me to discover something of a new experience. There's nothing dry or intellectual about that. And I think that that's such a good illustration of Gestalt can be like. Yeah.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I mean, it's like all of the resources and a little bit of
Yeah.
Kafka, a little bit of theater, a little bit of that's
For
impressive.
sure.
Yeah.
For sure. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, and I
cool.
use that image, in different ways. It comes up. It doesn't have to be a fly or jar, but that kind of experiment just springs out of you when you let that happen. I think with anyone, with a client, with a friend, with a family, and then when you let yourself have that experience and not censor yourself, wonderful things happen. And if it doesn't, it's okay. But like there's this kind of this possibility is born out of it, that I find to be very powerful. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah. That's really beautiful, Chris. Thank you for sharing
Ah,
that.
for sure,
And
for sure.
I am curious, you've talked about it. I wonder if you'd like to say anything more about where you think you'll be going next,
Uh-huh.
and also what you think out of, the circumstances that the world is in right now,
Mm.
what's next for Gestalt?
Ooh, big question. Big question. I think for me, I always feel like I have a book in me, whether it's a novel, whether it's
That must be a little uncomfortable sometimes.
it's like a book in me. Or it could be something that I've learned that I just want to talk about, that I want to write about. And I have like bits and pieces here and there. But that's something in my mind, that I try not to think about it being good enough or excellent or brilliant in some way. It's just what it is. And it's just like this interview where I don't have to be something or someone that I'm not, or that I'll never be. And I think the book is something that would be a tangible output for me. That would be such a good stimulation, because it's not about the book, it's more about the preparation of it. That will be wonderful. And Michael Miller taught me it's not about, the writing, it's about the editing. So you write as much, stuff as you want, and then you'll edit it later, which was very useful. So that's what I'm trying to do. In terms of, long-term sort of perspective, I can see myself expanding more into the community, especially being a part of Queens and having worked, for years in a very underserved community where they don't have necessary resources, whether it's the level of education, financial resources, or time, which is very important, that they don't have a lot of times. And or having the awareness of what is available. And I think, it all starts from, which is my dad's big project of training clinicians. So, because if I treat 100 or 200 people, that's just me. But if I, go beyond just, treating and start training, I think of whatever I do have available in me, that has a lasting impact, I feel like. And that's what
Yeah, it's
Rella's doing.
exponential. It's absolutely
Oh, yes.
exponential.
And I feel like there's so many young and, like up and coming Gestalt therapists that I want to connect with. And I want to expand that in a way that's available, and that we have enough financial resources ourselves to feel okay doing it pro bono for free, or even for very low cost. And a good colleague of mine talked about how little there is in the community for like psychologists, social workers, whoever, clinicians of color who don't have a very specific lens of training that can afford them to be, in touch with that. Because a lot of times, from my experience in psychology training, you learn to kill a part of yourself. And I think it was Miriam Poster who talks about supervision, who says your job as a supervisor is to ask what's unique about your supervisee and what is wonderful and resourceful about that. And it's not to flatten it and make it in a standard way, which a lot of times I feel like we're doing. This is how you do in an interview, and this is how you diagnose people, and this is how you formulate. And we need that as a foundation. But also, I feel like I came into grad school knowing what to do as a Gestalt informed therapist, and it needed a lot of refinement. But a lot of times, it was a very standardized way of delivering. And I feel like, at least when you're an internship level, or when you're licensed clinician level, there needs to be more support in a very specific way that you are and that you will find to be helpful. And there's, as far as I'm concerned, none. And I feel like to create a training space where you can be in touch with what makes you unique and what makes you you, including the painful things in you, that's, I think, like my ultimate goal and my dream.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
It's very much the difference between doing the job and you doing the job, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
that differentiation and
Yes.
individuation that you were talking about, sounds
Yeah.
like you have some experience and some ground to be able to bring into that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I feel, anyone can do CBT. Well, let me rephrase that. Anyone can do a CBT workbook. But I believe I can do it in a way that I do it. And that's different, right? It's maybe not how Aaron Beck wants me to do it. And I'm sure I've watched Judith Beck, and how she works. It's very unique about her, which is brilliant. And I really appreciate that part of her. And I don't want to, take anything away from CBT, but I do have problems when it's done mechanically in a way when you're not afforded the freedom to be you. And that is something I've seen. And that is not something that I feel comfortable with. That, to teach someone to say, this is the one way you need to do it, and you do not deviate from it. And that becomes dogma. And the same with Gestalt.
Yeah, I mean, that may be less in Gestalt, but I agree that it is also, there is a certain level of standardization and homogenization.
Yeah.
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 And I think a lot of the special individual characteristics are really rounded off.
Yes. Yes. And I think it also comes from our own anxiety, a fear of, what's allowed or not allowed according to whoever authority that you imagine. The
Mhm.
ghost of pearls would be looking over your shoulder and say, that's not Gestalt, or I don't know. But I think that goes exactly against the spirit of what we're trying to pursue.
Mhm.
And,
Well,
this
it's interesting.
liberation. Yeah.
I've done a whole bunch, they haven't been published yet, but I've done a whole bunch of interviews remembering Laura. And one of the things that I asked people is, what do you think Laura would have to say about what's going on right now? And instead of that isn't Gestalt, maybe that would be Fritz's ghost, like you said, but the responses were usually, I think she'd be really excited about it. And
That
it's
touches
just,
me.
for me, that's sort of the hallmark of, good teaching is when you're excited that your student is doing something
Yes.
that you never would have imagined.
Yes.
It's growth. That's
Yes.
what's supposed to happen.
That is just beautiful.
Mhm.
And she's the one who said resistance was once an assistance. And there's something so depathologizing and humanizing of the human plight of wanting to support themselves, wanting to survive, wanting to do well. And there's nothing that says we need to break it down and take it away from them, or interpret it away or teach them different things that's more adaptive. I think there's such acceptance of where they are and how they came to be that way. um, that is so human and important to me, to think in that way. And I think Perce brought in such dramatic freedom and passion and charisma, whereas Laura, I think Perce brings in that part of Gestalt that supports so many, including Rilla. And the feeling I get is this crown building, in a way that feels like, oh, I'm allowed to. I can be imperfect. I can be, a young Gestalt therapist and still be here. It's allowed, right? It's welcome. It's not only allowed, but also exciting. So yeah, I find that to be so liberating and warm. Yeah.
Yeah. And with adequate support, coming back to Rowella and Laura, right? And I think it's interesting, that idea that you're talking about of helping and supporting and teaching,
Yeah.
to allow other people to come into it, not to replicate it, but to come into doing it themselves.
Yes. Yes.
Hmm.
And I think we all need that playground. And Rilla talks about the sense of affordances, what is afforded in this relationship, and, what is supported. And I think we always kind of gauge that with the other, can I talk about this? Am I not allowed to talk? And that, I think, especially with Rilla and Michael and, the posters, it's always been like invited out of you. And that's, I think, something unique happens, instead of when you do all the talking and write it down, right? And I think that's when there's something deadening that happens, unless the others are invited in. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, I feel like I would love to have many more conversations with you, actually. But I'm wondering if there's any final thoughts that you would like to bring into this one in particular.
I have I have such appreciation of you, Heather, because it just, I don't know, it gave me this time, which is rare, I think, to reflect and share. If I did this in front of a camera alone, it would have felt very different, I think. And I think, because it was a conversation, and because we've seen each other, known each other from before, and there was something very heartfelt that I felt between us, that it's invited out of me to be relaxed, to be sort of in touch with things that I haven't thought about, and kind of unencumbered to just kind of bring it up, and this maybe background worry about what would people think, or should I have left this one out, that one out. It's just kind of vanished, and that in itself, I think, was a wonderful experience.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think, you know, it kind of expands beyond who else is out there, you know, which Gestalt therapist am I, kind of missing out on that I want to connect with. And I think that there's so many probably that, you know, this could be a good opportunity to put myself out there, which is a big risk for me
Mm,
too, but also exciting.
I know,
And
I
yeah,
appreciate it. And I really appreciate the depth and the layeredness of what you bring. So thank you. It was really, really nice to meet you.
likewise,
Mm,
I wish to learn more about you one day when it's afforded. But yeah, I really appreciate this opportunity.
okay. So should we leave it here then?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.